So if you're watching this on video, you will have noticed my background screen has changed because we're going through a heat wave at the moment in Australia. But if you're on audio, do not worry about it. Let's just go ahead.
All right. So I think I was talking about sort of the experience of medical training and how really, medical students and below, like, undergrad, pre-med students really shielded from the experience of the hierarchy, but it really takes off once you enter clinical training, and that's like internship and residency. And of course, the power dynamics they're inherent there because of the overt hierarchy. And then anytime we're dealing with human beings just in nature, right, we have like our inherent beliefs and biases, and people bring these to their dynamics, whether no matter how hard you try to be professional, whatever that word really means. I think it's just like to exist in a version of yourself that is as devoid of like personal input as possible. That's like in my mind what it feels like. It just doesn't happen. It just does not
Yeah, I
happen.
think that professionalism is meant to be like a courtesy of sorts. You be
Yes,
professional with everyone,
that's right.
but that courtesy can sometimes actually add to that marginalization
Yeah,
when people are so different. That's what I found in my life, to be honest. Like,
yeah,
we talk about power dynamics, but to me, it shows up in very real ways. Like, in my experience, or at least as a psychologist, I can definitely speak to. No, let me start this all over again.
yeah,
I've been through it my whole professional life.
yeah.
I've never been able to give meaning to it until like pop culture started bringing in words. And now, as a practicing in my professional, yes, marginalization exists through tokenism, through microaggressions, through stereotyping and biases. That's
Mm.
what adds to the dynamic. And, it can be actually quite confronting when you're
Mm-hmm.
confronted with those, particularly the stuff that you can't really pin on people to take them to HR, the micro stuff, the tokenistic
Yes,
stuff,
that's what I was
the
gonna.
unconscious bias. I'm
Yes,
not
that's
being
what I was gonna
racist,
ask
but
you, and that's what actually what prompted me to say, you know what, I think we need to hit the record button. Is how do you know? How does a person know when you're being tokenized, or like it's sort of right, like that? It's such a such a subtlety, almost imperceptible to anyone else who doesn't feel it, right? Who doesn't, and then so, people who are on the opposite side of it can say, well, no, that's just your perception. That's just it's you're just
that's
projecting,
you.
or
You're being sensitive.
yeah. Oh gosh,
You're
Lord,
being
that
angry.
is, yeah. Let's not go there. That's you're being too sensitive
Or
right
what's even worse, you see somebody else going through it and you think that's not okay, but they make commentary on that person and how that person's just not really, in favor for bringing up what they do. And you think, well, I certainly can't bring up any conversations and topics.
exactly.
And
That's a
sometimes the stakes
microaggression.
are quite high.
Yeah,
The stakes are high. Like
absolutely.
if you're
Yeah,
the main breadwinner of the family,
yeah.
if you're trying to get into a certain specialty, like,
Mm-hmm.
there's this whole rife of discrimination really of what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and the stereotyping I think is quite common. Like we know about it, talk about it, particularly in terms of like women, LGBTIQ,
Mm-hmm.
disabilities, race. Like these are like popular catchphrases if
Mm-hmm.
people are aware of these stereotypings that contribute to marginalization of power. People can talk about, hey, this limits my opportunity. This is reinforcing power imbalances. This is not okay. And there is also other stuff, but that's a lot more subtle. And I think that's where the, issues of like tokenism comes in. When you're promoted just to fill a diversity quota or maintain a certain image of the
That's
organization.
right. Oh yeah, that's
Um,
big. Maintaining an image. I've seen that in
yeah.
practice, like the images that will be chosen, like right, like in if there's a company wide event, and there's a photographer going around taking pictures of people at the event, the ones that will get chosen to be on the website or so, right, are the ones that seem the most diverse. It's a well known phenomenon, right? And we know the people looking at it, we know
Yeah.
what we're seeing. I wonder if other people know what
Yeah.
they're looking at, or if it's just like, oh,
Mm.
that's lovely.
And it can show up just in your personal life too. So I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Mm-hmm.
There is there's often fine print that people say by consenting to participate, you also consent to
Oh
be
yeah.
used for marketing and promotional
Your
materials. So,
likeness,
sometimes
yes.
you need to be really careful with that stuff. So I remember someone invited me to, well, it was like a sexpo event.
Oh,
And they were like, yeah, would you like to come along? I think it'll be really great and fun. And so my thought at the time was not even should I attend or not. I just thought, is this a ticketed event? At an event like this, can you imagine the diversity, group sitting around being like, we need to extend our Sexpo audience to like, a more diverse demographic. Whose photos do you think should be on our next billboard across
oh
some
God.
bridge? Oh, here's Toltu. You can use her because she showed up to the event, for whatever reason.
Oh
But,
Lord.
that's the sort of stuff of what I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and it's often done with this unconscious bias, and sometimes it's
Certainly.
done overtly racistly as well.
Yeah.
But what it
Yeah.
does is actually, it just goes, and I think the Aboriginal people experience it too within Australia. There's such
Mm-hmm.
a diverse community here, our native First Peoples, and often what people will do is just use their stuff to say, "Yep, tick box, we're
That's
doing
right.
it."
That's right.
And what it actually reflects is a lack of genuine inclusion, a lack
Mm-hmm.
of genuine support, or a willingness to understand. And so that tokenism, I think,
It's really
who
hard.
wants to
It's
go?
really
Who
hard to
wants to
live
go to
out.
Sexpo? Do you want to come?
Right. Yeah. I mean, totally. That's a funny story and a funny, like, example of it. But it's true. I mean, it's really hard to live that out and experience it, and to be aware of it. Most importantly, is to be aware that
Mm,
of the possibility, even if you don't know it for certainty, like it's as a certainty, to the possibility that your designation, the reason why you have been chosen for a specific thing over someone else who maybe doesn't fit the same demographic, might be just because of what it looks like for the organization, right? Some people are perfectly fine. They're like, hey, that's my personal gain, right? I know, yeah,
mm.
it might not be savory reasons why I was selected, but it's still working toward my overall good. But I don't. It's just hard to live that out and be aware of that possibility, like I say, because of course you don't know for
Yeah,
certain. You can't prove it, right? No one's gonna just be
well,
like,
sometimes.
yeah, that's why we chose you.
Sometimes you find out though, and so maybe not when you're initially hired, and that just that feeling of when you're hired, you think you're there, but everyone knows why you're there,
Yeah.
and so it's about and the reality is this can, because there's that lack of genuine inclusion and support, it can actually lead to a lot more
Mm-hmm.
more serious issues, and
Mm-hmm.
it starts from things like microaggressions,
Mm-hmm.
insensitive comments or behaviors, based on aspects of your identity
Mm-hmm.
that cause emotional harm. It undermines your confidence or your
Mm-hmm.
sense of belonging in the workplace. And, eventually, again, because that commitment to ongoing relationship is not there, people end up leaving, or people end up finding out, holy moly, I was just hired to be,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um,
Yeah.
and everyone knew it but me. And so I think you can handle it in different ways. You could say, well, this is not for me, and step away. But there
Yeah.
are people who say, well, no, the system is thwarted somewhat,
Mm-hmm.
or corrupted, or discolored. Discolored. But I think, some people will say, no, I'm going to work through and then make my way to the top. And so you look at people like yourself, for example,
Mm-hmm.
the number of female physicians who are of African American descent,
Mm-hmm.
or who identify as being people of color, a very minority. It'd probably be easy for you to drop out and do something else. So
Mm-hmm.
there's that whole element that I think is like rarely discussed.
Yeah.
It's starting to come up, I think, with stereotyping. People are really big on that,
Yeah.
but it's the more subtle versions of like tokenism and
Yeah.
microaggressions, or people correcting your spelling mistakes and things like that. I'm like, well, no one asked you to correct my spelling, or you might say something and they like start correcting, and you think, no,
I want
I'm
to
not
play
okay
devil's
with.
advocate here, and just speak to, again, like I said, it's always, I think you can gain the most perspective when you start from a place of normalization and just understanding, right? Like that it's the outcome is undesired for at least by one party's experience,
Yep.
but the root of these behaviors, which are inherently human, right, are sort of ingrained into our functioning, our brain's function, right? Like especially our prefrontal cortex is really what it does. Its job is to create meaning and assign order. And so,
Yeah.
right, it's not altogether an abnormal thing. I mean, if you had to approach every situation from scratch and try to understand it from scratch, that is, I mean, you'd never make it through. You would spend your time trying to understand the first 2 minutes of your day. So, right, patterns are essentially how our brains work to categorize and move very quickly through the world. And of course, that's where, recognizing patterns and putting things together, it gets you from point A to point B and C and D very quickly. But there's a lot of assumption in there as well. There's a lot of assumption and not taking into account the nuances of the specific situation or the specific circumstance. So it's not an abnormal thing that we all do. And I think it's important to understand that it's something that every single human being does and has, right? As far as bias is concerned, we all have this. And our brains all operate in the same way. But the problem of it is like the behaviors to try to seemingly suppress the obvious nature of those habits, right? Like, so to not where, stereotyping we all get is not a good thing. Racism we all get is not a good thing. Genderism, right? Like it's sexism, ageism, all the isms, we know they're not as overt practices are not good things. And so because our brains are sort of like hardwired to think in those categories, they've gone underground, essentially, those behaviors, right? And that's what you're speaking to in the very subtle practices of, okay, so I'm not obviously doing something that's racist, but by my words and by my actions, and it could easily be attributed to personal preference, right? If somebody were confronted by it, they could say, well, that's just my personal preference. But what about
I like having an environment with just white people around. That's my personal preference.
Right. Well, that's what it said. That is exactly what it said. It's like, well, I'm just proud of my, I'm just proud of my culture, which anybody has the right to be proud of. That's right. I mean, that's why I'm saying you can't confront it, right? So what do you, how do you think a person, can reconcile? And I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who, who has the inherent biases and who has maybe tendencies that align with any of the isms. Yeah. How do you become, self-aware and, maybe start to examine your practices or your thoughts and look for any of those isms that have that have become underground and things that are coming out in very, very subtle ways of acting. Here's the thing.
When people often say things like, oh, I didn't realize that was happening. Oh, I didn't recognize that my workforce was only male or only female or only this particular, type of person, whatever that person is. I think there needs to be an understanding that, yes, our brains are wired to create some kind of order or some kind of pattern. However, I think as we go into positions of leadership, there's a responsibility to create new patterns or to recognize that there are different patterns that exist around you. So I'll give you an example that doesn't relate to work, where you have no choice but to create new patterns. And so that's parenting. So life before a parent, your brain functioned and created patterns in certain different ways, but as you transition into a new space of life and you have a child brought in, all of those patterns for the most part are disrupted, and you have to make space for that. And it's not easy, and you make a lot of mistakes, but you have the openness and the curiosity and sometimes the odd nervous breakdown to try and make those new patterns work. And I think it's the same in the workplace. As you move up in positions of responsibility, you have an onus to learn what those patterns are, which you may not have had to before because,
Right.
it didn't matter to you, it wasn't relevant to you. But I think, even thinking about living in a community, and when a new community or a new person arrives and they look remarkably different or act different, I think there's an onus on the people who have the power, who are the majority, to create some kind of courtesy, you will, or relationship building rather, to engage with that person. And I think, yeah, you can say, oh, well, we didn't know. That's fine and all well and good.
Right.
But now that this change is here, what are you doing to match or meet that? I think that's a question that needs to be had, because it puts the onus on the people in positions of power.
Yes, certainly. I couldn't agree with you more, and I wanna probe you a little bit more on this, and that
Yeah.
is so. I think that practice is well understood, and that's sort of what is behind. Like anytime there is some egregious misstep,
Yeah.
and there's all of the media storm happens, and the press conferences happen, and the right. And it's the same talking points. We're going to learn from this mistake. We're do more training. Is that the right way to go about it? Like, I mean, I've participated in the, and I think most people have these trainings that like bias training.
I think there is a benefit in training because it allows you to set the scene in terms of the language and stuff. I
What
think
kind
it's
of
very
training, though?
problematic when you're only relying on training.
Yeah,
And I think that's what a lot of organizations do. They say, we've done the training, we're fully aware of it now.
Yeah.
And so there's always a place for that training, I think. But what happens is organizations rely on that only.
Yeah.
And you can see the organizations that do that because they have their motherhood statements on their websites, but you go into the workplace. And again, that genuine inclusion and relationship building is not there
It's
at all.
not there.
Because they've only relied on training.
Right, absolutely. You have the right words and the right buzzwords, especially, and the beautiful language, as I said before. But the culture and the understanding, especially because there is inherent pressure that we put on each other in community settings by our actions and behaviors. What is often played out is something that's very different from the flowery language. And I guess what I was asking about, is training enough? I guess it's specific. What I should have asked is, like, what type of training is actually meaningful, right? Because modules and those I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I think, I think, look, even those modules, I think the modules and training is a good place for everyone to do it and then start the conversation.
Conversation, that's where I'm trying to go here. Yes.
Yeah, so and even like relationship building.
Yes.
And about seeing, well, what is it that we need to be aware of? Because every workplace is nuanced. And I think what those modules and trainings do is they give everyone a base from which we can start to have conversations that lead into different spaces and places, just like trees and plants, like, the branches and trunks can go in different directions depending on what the organization's looking for. Yeah, I think, maybe even asking for some organizations, well, if it exists and you're still functioning, then why do you need to think about it?
Yeah. Yeah. I know.
And that's when they start telling you, oh, but no, but there's this issue and that issue. And I think that would be the space from where I would start to work on creating genuine relationships. Because if they can't even articulate to you why the current situation is a problem, then they sound then it's a pre-contemplative perspective on the change process. They don't even think there's a problem.
Right.
Why should they change?
That's right. Yeah. And I think
let's finish up here.
Okay, yeah.
Because I feel like I had a few technical issues. I feel like we should, I don't know if you want to go. I feel like this is a conversation. We should just keep going with this, but might give it a break with the episodes.
Yeah,
here.
Absolutely. I agree. I think there's more to expand on here, but for this episode, this is a decent place to wrap things up. So again, as we always do, we want to hear from you guys on these experiences, whether or not you've experienced any of them in your personal lives and your professional lives. What you think of the dynamic of interpersonal relationships in the professional setting, power dynamics, and how they express themselves in different relationships, especially in the professional setting, but of course in the personal setting as well. Please let us know. Yeah, we do want to hear from you. If there's something that we didn't talk about in this episode that you want to hear us speak on, let us know that too. You can always find us on IG. We also have an email, thecodedswitch@gmail.com, that you can send us messages on. Otherwise, you know where to find us on podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google. What else am I missing? Of course, if you want to see our lovely faces, on YouTube too. Listen, comment, share, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Coded Switch.
See you then.